We now come to the urgent question. Bob Seeley.
Mr. Speaker, to ask about international supplies of military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has been leading international support for the armed forces of Ukraine for 10 years since Russia first invaded Crimea in 2014, training more than 60,000 new recruits since 2015 and committing almost £12 billion in economic, humanitarian and military aid since 2022. From the UK-founded and administered International Fund for Ukraine, which has pledged more than £900 million, to spearheading capability coalitions, our efforts have paved the way and made a genuine difference. Our NLAW anti-tank missiles and our javelins helped brave Ukrainians devastate Putin's menacing 40-mile armoured convoy, which was headed for Kiev. We were the first to send main battle tanks with our Challenger squadron, plus 500 armoured vehicles and 15,000 anti-armour weapons. Last week, the Defence Secretary announced to this House a new package, of 200 Brimstone anti-tank missiles, plus £245 million for artillery munitions. The UK will also co-lead an international capability coalition to supply cutting-edge drones to Ukraine, alongside Latvia, in addition to the UK's co-leadership of the International Maritime Capability Coalition. The Defence Secretary has urged partners and allies to commit to long-term support for Ukraine. At the NATO Defence Ministers meeting on the 15th of February, the Defence Secretary, with his counterparts from 14 NATO allies and Sweden, signed an agreement on 2 new multinational procurement initiatives, or MPIs, focusing on munitions and missiles. Spearheaded by the UK, these initiatives aim to increase defence industrial capacity across the Euro-Atlantic area, replenish stockpiles at pace and continue support to Ukraine.
Bob Seeley.
Government for its impressive record. But does he accept that equipment pledged by NATO nations is not reaching Ukraine in anything like the amounts promised? Does he accept, for example, that out of 1 million shells promised by EU nations, something like less than a third have arrived? Over 300 artillery barrels are reaching the end of their productive life this year. Very few F-16 pilots are being trained, and the Ukrainians are perilously short of air defence. This is at a time when the Russians are now on war footing. 40% of all government spending is geared towards the destruction of the Ukrainian state. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, may I ask whether Defence Intelligence, the government, reckons that the Ukrainians will be able to hold their current positions? If so, for how long? And when will artillery stocks run even lower and fall off a cliff edge? To confirm that we have delivered on all our pledges. To ask, I was in East Ukraine last week, after the obliteration of the frontline town of Avdiivka, does he understand that Ukrainians are now asking which of our towns is next to be destroyed by Russian artillery, and that Ukrainian soldiers are dying because they lack kit? And finally, Mr. Speaker, does he accept that this is becoming an acutely dangerous situation for everybody, because the forces of fascism are beginning to overpower free states and their NATO allies? And where does he believe we may be in the next few months in terms of security throughout Europe? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, and I pay tribute to him and all parliamentarians who visited Ukraine and shown our solidarity and support with our ally. I know that he has a background as an officer in the Intelligence Corps, and obviously, therefore, he speaks with not only the passion that we all share, but significant expertise on these matters. Equally, he will therefore be aware that there is a limit, clearly, to what I can say on the operational situation, and indeed in terms of, for example, being drawn into trying to estimate the level of supplies going forward, etc. These are all sensitive and important points. I think what we can all agree on, it's important what he says about air support and training. I was in RAF Valley very recently. As I understand, we've trained 26 Ukrainians there, or are training them, for elementary flying training. Of course, we aren't flying the F-16, we have Typhoon F-35, so other countries will be providing the actual platforms. In terms of air defence, he's absolutely right. This is a critical part of the conflict. We need to supply more. We've provided over 1,000 air defence systems, but we want to do more. In terms of the overall position, as I said, we can't provide, if you like, a running commentary on the exact operational situation. We do provide these very regular tweets showing what we can share in terms of intelligence. But I think fundamentally, he is right to warn all of us, and indeed our allies, of the risk were the situation to be reversed. Because we do know, we can certainly say with some certainty, that when the war started, perhaps we would all have been surprised to be in this situation, with Ukraine having won back so much territory and frankly remained in the fight. And that is thanks in a huge part to the role of the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, and we should be very proud of that. As the Secretary of State confirmed in his very recent oral statement, we provided NLAW weapons before Russia invaded. We have been training Ukrainians since 2014, 60,000 in total, but I know there's more to do. What I would highlight to my honourable friend, as I said, he has a very good understanding of these matters. These capability coalitions, one on drones, the other on maritime, are a very good way that we can take the support that's provided and turn it into targeted and effective capability at the front line. But we're clear we need to do more, and our allies need to stay with us in the fight.
Shadow Minister Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we mark 2 years since Vladimir Putin's brutal illegal invasion began, it should be a source of pride for all in this House that the UK remains totally united and committed to support Ukraine. We must continue to stand with the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes for them to win. On military help for Ukraine and on reinforcing NATO allies, the UK government have had and will continue to have the fullest Labour support. At yesterday's opening of the Paris summit to shore up support for Ukraine, Western leaders rightly made clear that Russia is far from a spent force, and if Putin wins, he will not stop at Ukraine. As Russia steps up its war effort, we must step up UK support, and so must Ukraine's other allies. Labour welcomes the 200 extra Brimstone anti-tank missiles and the 245 million artillery munitions package for Ukraine, which the government announced this weekend. Ministers favour ad hoc announcements over a fuller military aid plan for Ukraine, but how can industry invest and mobilise with confidence without a long-term plan to work against? On stepping up Western support for Ukraine, how are we coordinating with our NATO allies to ensure our munitions support is providing Ukraine with the urgent and sustained help it needs? And of the 2.5 billion announced for 2024, can the Minister confirm how much is being spent on Ukraine and how much is being spent on UK operational costs at NATO bases? Given the importance of the Paris summit for Ukraine, could the Minister also set out why the Prime Minister was unable to attend the event, unlike other key Western leaders? Mr. Speaker, there could be a changing government this year, but there will be no change in Britain's resolve to stand with Ukraine, confront Russian aggression and pursue Putin for his war crimes.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I am very grateful to the honourable gentleman for continuing to show solidarity for the consensus that exists across this House, and in particular for his specific mention of the Brimstone gifting and the £245 million recently announced for artillery munitions. But he talks about a longer-term plan. Just to be clear, the war is happening now and today, and the key focus of that £2.5 billion support for Ukraine is this financial year in getting support into the country as soon as possible, because that's when they need it. Of course, we want to have a long-term plan as well, and I'm clear that the UK will play a very significant role in helping Ukraine when it is fully free to get back to the level of prosperity it would expect. But for now, we have to focus on what is a very challenging situation. But to give one example, one of the most important capabilities we've seen in Ukraine has been drones. It's arguably transformed the nature of warfare in this conflict. Last week, I was pleased to announce our own uncrewed strategy, and in doing so, to talk about the example of the Malloy drone, the T-150. This has been lifting blood, munitions and other key supplies to the Ukrainian Marines on the bank of Dnieper. It's done an incredible job. We have provided 4,000 drones into Ukraine. We're going to keep doing that. We've got the 200 million. It shows, yes, it's about providing the shells, the munitions, but we've also got to provide the way of fighting with them. We've got to assist to ensure we deliver the actual capability. That's why those coalitions are so important. But I'm glad that he supports us in the round, and I think the message we send is this House is united in supporting Ukraine.
And the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
The Minister referred to the training that started in 2014, the year after, in my view, the House took the wrong decision over the Syria vote, which led to the USSR, to Russia giving help to Assad, the taking of Crimea, the infiltration of the eastern side of Ukraine, and various other problems. As Ukraine's security, in effect, is our security and those of our NATO allies, will the Minister confirm that we will do all we can to try to make sure Ukraine is safe and that Russia at some stage returns to being a peaceful nation devoted to the prosperity of its own people rather than doing down other people?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point. He's absolutely right. Their security is our security. We need to support Ukraine because it is morally the right thing to do, to support a free country that's been illegally invaded. But we should be absolutely clear it is also in our strategic interest and those of all of our democratic allies, because we don't want to see an emboldened Russia, not least because of the impact that could have on other potential adversaries.
SNP spokesperson Drew Hendry.
Thank you. Ukraine is on the front line not only of its own battles, but indeed for those of international democracy and law. We cannot leave them without in a time of need. Their fight is our fight. So let's look at what the UK government can do. We mustn't allow Putin's plan to wait until the international community loses interest to succeed. Will the UK government prepare an ICC case against Russia for its bombardment of civilians in Ukraine? What more can the UK government do to ensure the safety of Ukrainian skies? And what can the UK government do to ensure a united and collective Western effort in continued support for Ukraine?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman and again for the support of the SNP and ensuring we have this strong consensus across the House supporting Ukraine. As he said, their fight is our fight, and I strongly agree. He's right about the ICC. In terms of where the MOD is focused, he makes an important point about the threat in the air. I said to my honourable friend, air defence has been absolutely critical, but of course that fight takes many forms. We need to look at ground-to-air systems, but also drones, which have proliferated, and it's extraordinary the impact they have had. We know that we can't provide the F-16, which is their fighter of choice, but we've done what we can by providing the elementary flying training, and I absolutely assure him we will do everything we possibly can.
Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Quin.
Speaker, I absolutely welcome all the government's been doing, including relating to brimstone and the package of £245 million worth of ammunition. But can I ask specifically about 155mm shells in the BAE production line? Have they now got the orders to ensure they're working at maximum capacity on a war footing to produce all they can to support Ukraine and indeed in due course our own stockpiles?
Minister.
Well, it's a pleasure to take, I think, what is the first intervention of my old friend in the Chamber since he became Chairman of the Select Committee, and I look forward to further discussions with him later this afternoon on other matters in front of the committee. But he's absolutely right to stress the importance of that contract, Mr. Speaker. 155, this is one of the fundamental munitions we need to see both replenished for the UK armed forces and, where possible, provided into Ukraine along with other key artillery classes. What I can confirm, we signed that contract with BAE last July. It should lead to an 8-fold increase in 155 production, initially in the Washington plant, but also thereafter in South Wales. And I'm just keen to see that get going as soon as possible, frankly.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MOD has clearly done a decent job of supporting Ukraine, but I still doubt that the government as a whole is seized of the urgent critical nature of this crisis. I return to the question I asked last week to the Secretary of State. Why, when it was clear early in 2022 that this was going to be very much an artillery war dating back to the last century, did it take until the mid-2023 to place the order for additional artillery shells? He should have the answer by now.
Minister.
Well, I referred to the previous answer I gave, where I was absolutely clear. We placed that order last July. That's for our own armed forces. That's an 8-fold increase. But we have provided 300,000 artillery shells into Ukraine. We have procured them, sir. We've done that not just from this country. We've done it through rapid procurement, through DNS, and all I can say is I pay tribute to that effort. We all know we need to go further. I think the other part is this. It's not just what we've procured. This country has played a leading role in ensuring that other nations join us and provide more munitions. That's actually as much about the key part of the role we've played.
Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly joint session in Brussels, top military leaders described to us their concern that the EU ethical banking laws are going to stop investment in arms companies. So can I ask my honourable friend that, to confirm that the UK will always make sure that the money needed to invest in making sure that Europe can protect itself against Russian aggression will be there and the arms can be manufactured?
Well, my right friend asked an excellent point. Both the Secretary of State and I have commented on this, Mr. Speaker. I've held meetings at the Treasury with defence companies about the issue of ESG and also with financial institutions at Rothschild's in the city, because it is quite extraordinary that anyone should think we shouldn't invest in core munitions when we see now that the cause they support is peace and freedom and democracy. Quite simply, if we do not fund our defence sector, we will not be able to defend those very fine principles.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Zelensky said yesterday that without new military aid from the United States, Ukraine would be unable to defend the Black Sea shipping corridor. This corridor has enabled the export of 33 million metric tons of Ukrainian grain and has been enabled in part by the supply by the UK of the Storm Shadow missile, by France of the Scalp missile. What is the government discussing with German counterparts about their potential to supply their equivalent, the Taurus missile system?
Well, I know the Honourable Gentleman also served and speaks with expertise on these matters, and absolutely right to raise the strategic importance of the Black Sea. We've had huge progress in this area. I believe since we reopened that corridor, through the success that the Ukrainians have had with our support in pushing back the Russian fleet to the east, that something like 19 million tonnes of grain have got through. It just underlines how important that corridor is. But he's absolutely right. We do need to look at what more we can do. Obviously, I'm not going to comment on sensitive matters about individual countries' capabilities, but to be rest assured that obviously we continue to engage with all of our allies on these points.
Jesse Dodd.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a direct threat to Europe and, of course, to wider global security. As my honourable friend will know, Russia itself has increased, as part of its war mobilisation, its production of shells and ammunition by some factor of 10, or is planning to over the next 2 or 3 years. Can I ask my honourable friend what conversations he has had across Europe and with NATO allies about the longer-term response to this serious challenge?
Minister.
Well, my own friend obviously recently joined the Select Committee, and I welcome him, makes an excellent point. I'd say, first of all, it is true that there is a lot of speculation about the level of Russian production. They've needed to do that because they've lost themselves a huge amount of ordnance, armoured vehicles, and, of course, tragically, frankly, personnel in very large numbers. In terms of the long term, I would draw his attention to the MPIs. This is where we are joining together with other NATO members for collective, shall we say, orders of ordnance. The first one we've announced is for missiles and for munitions. I think that's a really powerful signal. Hopefully it will send a strong demand signal to industry in Europe, but also it sends a signal to Putin and indeed to the world that we are determined to stand together and stand up to Putin.
Great record of supporting Ukraine, and for example training Ukrainian troops is something that we can really be proud of. But can I press the Minister, of the 2.5 billion for 2024, can he please confirm how much is being spent on Ukraine and how much is being spent on UK operational costs at NATO basis?
Minister.
My honourable friend, the Minister of the Armed Forces, answered this in detail at oral questions, and I think the key point is that we will not do a line-by-line breakdown of every single aspect of the £2.5 billion. I can assure him it's an incredibly important step forward in our support to Ukraine. As he knows, what we have been able to do is confirm it includes, for example, £245 million on artillery munition and £200 million on drones. These are incredibly important commitments. It goes with all the other efforts we've made, but we know that there is more to do with our allies.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Oh, Speaker, I apologise. My lip reading is not as good as it used to be. Can I say to my honourable friend, I and a group of colleagues went to the United States before Christmas to try and persuade the Republicans there to vote this bill through urgently. We had a marginal effect on them, but the thing that I said to them was, you are facing an axis of authoritarianism. China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, all in league together, and they are winning. And does he not agree to me, when I was in Ukraine, I saw them taking mines out with bayonets, that's the Ukrainians, not having the equipment. So does he not agree with me? What this has done is told us we are none of us ready for what really war is all about. Barbed wire, minefields and artillery shells. We need to do more. Does he not agree with that?
Minister.
Well, I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for his efforts engaging with the US. It's incredibly important. Obviously, the positions that they take, the decisions they make on support are a matter for their government and for their own legislature. All I would say is he's absolutely right to make the wider strategic point. Surely, the one thing we are all united on is that we need to have deterrent against all the adversary threats we face around the world, and that if Russia were to, and I sincerely hope this is not the case, but to make much more progress and succeed, it would embolden other adversaries. And he's right about the horrors, frankly, of the nature of warfare. That's why we need to invest in our own armed forces, in our own conventional deterrent, but above all, to keep supporting Ukraine as much as we possibly can.
Alison Thulis.
The Whalo Trust estimate that there have been around 2 million landmines laid in Ukraine, and Mike Newton from the Halo Trust says that Ukraine cannot be rebuilt until the landmines are removed. Life itself depends on getting rid of them. So can I ask the Minister, what more is he doing to ensure that funds go to the demining of Ukraine, and what more preventative work can he do internationally to persuade those countries that are supplying landmines to desist from doing so and sign the Landmine Convention?
Well, and it follows on from my honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green. It's an excellent point about mines. I'm happy to go away and look into that and see what we are able to say about what we're doing. Obviously, there is also the issue of naval mines, as you will appreciate, and within the Maritime Capability Coalition, I believe that is something we will be looking at, but there's some sensitivity here. I'll look into it further. But absolutely, in terms of those countries providing those munitions, I can't say standing here that there's a button I can press to stop that from happening, but we do know that Putin keeps some rather interesting company, and that we as democracies need to stand together to ensure that we support Ukraine in this fight.
Jack LaPlesta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the fantastic work being done by DE&S in my constituency in ensuring that the overwhelming amount of support and military equipment we've supplied arrives on time to the front line as quickly as possible? And can I ask what we can do to speed up the process of manufacturing collaboration between British and UK companies in country, in Ukraine, because that's going to be huge in the future to ensure they can produce their own kit on the ground and provide a deterrent after they've beaten the Russians.
Minister.
Well, my friend is absolutely sterling in his championship for Ukraine, championing their cause, and of course for his constituency, the excellent work of D&S down in Abbey Wood. Visited there twice now. Excellent leadership under Andy Startman. He's right. They have been responsible for procuring at pace a huge amount of munitions and material into Ukraine. But he's right. We also need to think about the long term and how Ukraine can start to build its own industrial base. That's why we recently had our first defence trade visit there, and I'm keen to see much more of that, and pleased to have his support in that to that end.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. Can I take this opportunity to reiterate how proud we are of our armed forces personnel who have worked round the clock to train and support Ukraine recruits as part of Op Interflex, how vitally important this support has been, and urge the government to confirm where this programme will be after the summer, and that we will make this commitment for as long as it takes Ukraine to win.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful. It makes a very good point. We should pay tribute to all of the personnel involved in Operation Interflex, the huge amount of training we've provided. I remember going to Salisbury Plain, meeting the Irish Guards, who were at that moment training Ukrainian civilians of all backgrounds who would have but weeks of training and then return to what would be a pretty attritional conflict, which is something we all need to reflect upon. It's had international support from many other nations all around the country. It's an incredible operation, but she's absolutely right. We're in it for the long term, and we're going to keep going, training Ukrainians to go and defend their homeland.
Faisal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've just returned from Ukraine, and there was absolutely nothing but praise for what Britain has done in providing the munitions and equipment that's required, and indeed standing up to Putin when so many others blinked at that moment. But it's very, very clear that what is happening in Ukraine will move out further than that. Putin is now more powerful than Stalin, trying to emulate what Stalin did in Eastern Europe. Can we agree that Europe is at war? This affects us. This affects our economy and our security. We've done leadership, shown leadership up to now. Can we continue that with allowing frozen assets based in the UK belonging to Russia to be slid across the table to Ukraine?
Minister.
Well, my right friend, as ever, makes some excellent points. I pay tribute to him, as with other colleagues, going out to Ukraine to show that we stand 100% with them, to show our solidarity as parliamentarians with them as a free democracy. As to the point, he makes an excellent point on Russian sanctioned frozen assets. I think what the Prime Minister said was pretty clear, which he wants to look at how we can do that. Obviously, he made the point we've got to work internationally, and that means particularly with the G7. Initially, I think we'll be looking at the interest earned on those assets, but definitely this is something across government we should be focusing on.
Neil Collins.
Thank you, Speaker. Will the government retain UK air defence capabilities supporting NATO allies on the front line like Poland? And can further medical units be dispatched to treat and rehabilitate any Ukrainian or any Brit injured by Russian forces?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I must admit I missed the first part of his question, and I'll write to him. My apologies for that. On the second part, I think within those training figures that I mentioned to his colleague, there is significant training for medical personnel as well. I'm happy to include that in the letter. But I think, look, whether it's training personnel for medical support, whether it's training their frontline soldiers, the effort we've put in place is huge. It is international, and we're going to do everything to keep it going.
James Sutherland.
Mr. Speaker, the number of NATO member countries meeting their 2% GDP commitment is expected to rise from 7 last year to 18 later this year. Indications from the US are also that the US government is more likely to release expected $60 billion of commitment to Ukraine once Republican congressmen have had their primaries. Could the Minister please confirm to the House that British defence industry at home is now on a war footing, and that we are best able to spend UOR, urgent operational requirement money, and deliver it for Ukraine?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend, as ever, asks an excellent question. I think the point is, which he's really highlighted, this has to be an international effort. And I know that there is a tendency to, shall we say, overplay the negative voices. I think my experience, certainly, of where I've been in these international meetings, overwhelmingly the consensus, huge desire to keep supporting Ukraine in every way possible, from small nations to large nations. Obviously, the role of the US is absolutely fundamental, but yes, I can give him that assurance. I'm clear I want to work with British defence industry to ramp up production. We'll be bringing forward a munition strategy soon, and the goal of always-on production would be the one which would be most in the interest both of the military and of our defence sector.
Then Dave Griffith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, along with colleagues from across the House, I've also just returned from a sobering visit to Ukraine, during which we heard that what some refer to as the slow yes on providing military supplies from a number of our allies is costing lives on the front line and limiting military options. So can the Minister tell us what specific recent efforts the Government has made to convey a real sense of urgency to key allies, and will he urge his Cabinet colleagues to redouble their efforts in this respect?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I can assure her at every meeting we attend, in every engagement internationally, whether multilaterally or bilaterally, we do everything possible to encourage our allies to join us in their support. I think we can be clear, as I said in answer to the previous question, that although there is a tendency to pick out sort of negative voices, the overwhelming consensus amongst our allies is to want to support, to do more. You know, there'll always be a debate about how quickly we can get stuff into line. We've done everything possible to get our support out as quickly as possible, including, in fact, predating the war itself. So we can be proud of our efforts, but I'm acutely aware that we need to do more, and we need to do more in concert with our allies.
James.
It's at least partly because of the magnificent effort we've made over the last couple of years that, frankly, our stockpiles have now gone and our warehouses are actually empty. So while I very much welcome the announcement the government have made about the £245 million, for example, for the artillery shells that he just described, would you not agree with me that there have been a series of legalistic and bureaucratic delays to the issuing of contracts, and the British manufacturers are frustrated because they are unable to crack on with producing the kind of goods that we need?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I wouldn't say that we are now, the cupboard is empty. Obviously, we have to have our own levels of holdings for our own military, but we've gifted as much as we can. The obvious example, AS-90 we gifted, we've rapidly replaced that with the interim artillery solution from Sweden, the Archer gun. I would say earlier this morning, I'm pleased to say I announced the launch of the next stage of the new medium helicopter competition, which is an important procurement for the UK military. So I think it shows and speaks to the fact that we are still carrying out that core procurement for ourselves. And yes, in addition to 155, we've placed orders for LMM, for Starstreak, for a whole range of other munitions so that we can replenish. But we shouldn't be afraid of saying that what we have donated, what we have supported, and what we have procured internationally, which is a huge part of it, has played a massive role, which we should be proud of, whilst recognising the need with our allies to do as much as we can going forward.
Sorry, Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was privileged to join colleagues on a cross-party delegation to Ukraine this weekend. The shortage of equipment, ammunition and supplies came up time and again. Can I ask the Minister how the UK Government is monitoring and holding accountable those involved in the supply chain to prevent delay, misuse or diversion of military equipment?
Minister.
It's a good point, and obviously a lot of this work is happening internationally and in country with Ukraine. I can't go into operational details, but absolutely it's one thing to procure the equipment, the capabilities, whether that's buying internationally, gifting or contributing to international funds, as many countries do, in order for other countries to do it. We need to ensure it gets to the front line. It's a very good point.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In all the discussions of military hardware, it's easy to forget the human cost of this war, not least the 20,000 children stolen by the Russians and never returned to their families. As we said on day one, if Putin wins in Ukraine, he will not stop there. Other countries will be next, and that is why it is vital that the UK and allies continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need. But Russia must also pay. And can I ask the government to double down on the work that they are doing to use the proceeds of frozen Russian assets to pay for this war and the reconstruction of Ukraine, so Russia knows they cannot get away with this?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend who speaks with great passion, and she's absolutely right to talk about the need to hold Russia to account. We've said that repeatedly. We said it in reference to the war itself, to specific actions like Navalny, etc. We're under no illusion about the nature of that regime. We're also under no illusion about what would happen if they were to succeed. We've had that view right from the beginning, and it's brilliant that so many countries have joined us in that effort. But without those efforts from ourselves right at the beginning, I strongly believe Ukraine would not now still be in the fight. How do we keep them there? We've got to keep providing the munitions we've described. We've got to keep training the personnel in Interflex, and we've got to keep ensuring that our allies join us in all of those efforts.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. The US State Department has reportedly calculated that North Korea has delivered 10,000 containers of munitions to Russia for deployment in the Ukraine. What can be done to disrupt the supply chain?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful, gentlemen. As I said, it's not a straightforward point to answer. As I said right at the beginning to my honourable friend on the matter of things that are ultimately come from military intelligence, these are sensitive matters, but rest assured these are priorities that we look at with our international partners very closely.
Tim Long.
Mr. Speaker, I also joined my friend Wight and other colleagues in Ukraine at the weekend. The point about the slow, yes, the provision of kit and funds by the Rondelli is well made. As well as conventional warfare, the Russians are increasingly using cyber warfare, recently taking out virtually the whole mobile network with implications for the front line as well. Essential to countering that is advanced satellite technology provided by British companies, which also has applications for mine detection. Having recently had a spread of 30 metres, can now get it down to 5 centimetres through heat detection devices. These are really crucial. So can we make sure that we don't just limit our support conventional warfare ammunitions, but also look at high-tech and cyber warfare, which is going to be increasingly necessary?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes an extremely important point. We knew already that the battle space is contested. Forces need to be closely integrated. But what Ukraine has shown above all else is the extraordinary extent to which electronic warfare plays a role. The mass jamming across the domain, which this has to be factored into any kit you're using. It will have to be factored into procurement going forward. We have to be aware of these developments. What I would say to my honourable friend is we do have our own brilliant resources like the DSTL, and there are things we have done that are sensitive, that have supported as far as possible, but he's right to talk in particular about the importance of the space domain. The UK is lucky to have a very strong sovereign space industry supporting both defence and the civil sector, and I think the point is that going forward we need to be aware of how warfare is changing and be able to respond very rapidly in our procurement.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answers? They're very, very helpful and also very encouraging. Having read in the recent press on the price of military supplies and the protracted situation that Ukraine has been forced into, it is clear that help with military supplies is essential. Missiles, I understand, are costing up to as much as £1 million per missile, so it gives you an idea of the cost. Is there any more that can be done with our NATO allies, both financially and physically and militarily, to help ensure that Ukraine continues to have the means to stave off this ceaseless attack by Ukraine by Russia?
Minister.
As ever, the best till last, Mr. Speaker, and I'll keep saying that while, on that side, I think, possibly. Second last, my apologies. While he's called, I'll always say that. But, Mr. Speaker, it's a very good point about the cost, and actually, when we talk about the multilateral procurement initiative, you could argue it's like a bulk buy between nations, and obviously we want to see economies of scale for that in exchange for the massive demand signal that will be providing into European industry. But I think the key point is it's not just to send the demand signal, is to send ultimately the deterrence signal that if we in Europe rally round in European NATO along with our US allies and we really do step up the pace on industrial reinvigoration in the defence space, that will in itself be part of the deterrent message we send to Putin.
Tom Brown. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Along with colleagues across the House, I was in Ukraine at the weekend and I was struck by the gratitude by Ukrainians to the UK. I was also struck by the words of General Wesley Clark, who spoke at the Yalta European Strategy Conference, when he made a prediction that we are now in the second year of a 6-year war. If that prediction is accurate, could the Minister outline what efforts are underway to locate compatible ammunition supplies from countries with older stocks? And would he agree with me that it is important to get stuff out of stockpiles onto the front line in the Ukraine so that we can tip this war in the Ukrainians' favour?
Well, I also grateful to my friend and pay tribute to him as well as joining in other colleagues going out to Ukraine, showing the solidarity that we have for them and the strong cross-parliamentary consensus. What I would say is, often when we talk about the procurement for Ukraine, I think there can be some misunderstanding. Just to be clear, an awful lot of the munitions that have been provided were sourced internationally. And we don't necessarily go into the minute detail of that. But what I would say is, he's absolutely right. Initially, that means ultimately providing what would largely be ex-Soviet stock. But in the long term, we want to enable Ukraine to produce munitions to NATO standard, and we want to work closely with them on that. And that is how we get their industry into order so that they can sustain their own ability to fight over the long term.
That completes the urgent question. I'll let the front bench change over.